I want us to think this morning about who is seated at the table with Jesus. Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? But when he heard this, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have come to call not the righteous, but the sinners." And so this morning, seated at Jesus' table, is our first character, Matthew. Matthew is a tax collector. Matthew is one of those whom the Jewish people despised and hated. Why? Because he worked for the enemy. He worked for the Roman Empire. He collected their taxes. And it wasn't just enough that they collected the taxes for the Roman Empire, but often tax collectors would collect way beyond what they were supposed to. They collected more than was required. And therefore it made them rich. And the people hated that. Yet he's seated at the table of Jesus. We then hear about, straight after Jesus says to Matthew, "Come and follow me," Matthew holds a dinner party and he invites his friends. And would you believe those friends are other tax collectors and sinners? Because Matthew would have been displaced out of his community. So he's made a new community of other tax collectors and sinners. And so the scriptures and the commentators tell us that in that generalized term of sinners are people that society disregards. So seated there would have been prostitutes and harlots, would have been others who didn't fit into the mold and didn't toe the line in terms of their faith and society's laws. Jesus then is asked by a synagogue leader to come and raise his daughter from the dead. Can you imagine what that leader would have had to go through? How scandalous it would have been for him to approach Jesus to ask him for help, when he was a well-respected man in the community, a leader in the faith. Yet, we see his belief and trust in Jesus that he might do this miracle for him. And so seated at that table is a synagogue leader. And then while they're on the way to meet the synagogue leader's daughter, a woman encounters them. She's been bleeding, hemorrhaging for 12 years. According to the purity laws, she would have been put out of her community and her family because she was considered unclean. Nobody would have gone near her, afraid that even her arm or something small would touch them and therefore make them unclean. And then they would be out of circulation with the community while they underwent the rituals to be made clean again. In actual fact, if the woman had reached out to anybody, obviously other than Jesus, history tells us that that person would have screamed to alert others that this woman was reaching out to them and that they didn't want this, and to alert others to get away. She would have lost her family, her community, her church. She wouldn't have been allowed to go to worship. Yet she reaches out to Jesus, and Jesus calls her daughter. And he restores her, he heals her because of the kind of faith that she displays. She's seated here. And then Jesus continues and he goes to the house where the daughter is dead. And he puts out those who've gathered to begin the funeral preparations, the crowds, the flute players. And Jesus declares to them that she's not dead, but she's asleep, and the text tells us they laughed at him. And once they were put out, Jesus went to her and he took her by the hand, breaking another purity law, because you were not allowed to touch those who were dead because it made you unclean. But Jesus reaches out to her. She awakens and stands. Do you see the people that are seated at the table with Jesus? The unlikely, the sinners, the outcasts from society. They are the ones seated with Jesus. The question for us is, who's seated at our table? Who gets an invitation to be seated with us? In what ways are we challenged by those seated at the table, Jesus' table? Those whom Jesus has considered worthy, in need of mercy. When Jesus speaks to the Pharisees who are questioning why Jesus is mingling and associating himself with sinners, he replies with an Old Testament verse found in Hosea. I do not require sacrifice, but I require mercy. We are called to acts of mercy. Thanks be to God. Amen.